Ross, can I invite you to come and join me up here? Thanks everyone for being part of this today. So here's my copy of Superpower. It's very dog-eared because my 9-year-old Labrador puppy got hold of it the other night, and he's asked me to get you to sign it later if you don't mind. But Ross, can I just? I think the book's got, as one of my colleagues pointed out the other day, one of the most hopeful titles we've seen in association with a book about climate change. I can't remember ever hearing Australia being referred to as a potential superpower, except perhaps in sport, and maybe not so much now, even there. So for those who haven't read it yet, what is our low carbon opportunity?
Well, when the whole world has zero emissions, which we will need to have to stop climate change becoming worse and worse, climate conditions on Earth get warmer and more damaging the longer we don't have zero emissions. And the whole world in 2015 at Paris, all countries on Earth agreed on moving towards zero emissions. The implication of the Paris Agreement to hold temperature increases below 2 degrees and as close as possible to 1.5 degrees is that we would move towards zero emissions by mid-century or earlier. And in a world in which the whole world has zero emissions, Australia has special advantages. These are more obvious to me today than they were when I did my official reviews. The review for all of the governments of Australia, federal, state and territory, back in 2008, and for the Multi-Party Committee on Climate Change in 2011. The opportunity for Australia is more obvious now than then. What's changed? Most importantly, the cost of the equipment for zero emissions energy, renewable energy, has come down far more rapidly than anticipated. My 2008 review embodied more elaborate modelling over a longer forward perspective than had been attempted in Australia before, and I had to write into that assumptions about rate of improvement of renewable technologies, and I did that after consulting, well, my team was consulting with people who should know best, the people at the frontiers of research and people involved in business in renewable energy, and not only in Australia but in the US, Japan, Korea, China, the UK, Germany. And
this has long been one of the issues that has been seen to be something that will inhibit the take-up of renewable energy, the cost.
Yeah, and back then it was much more costly to produce electricity from wind or solar than from coal. Yeah. And I wrote into the modelling presumptions of reductions in cost, for example, of solar photovoltaic by a few percent per annum. Yeah. That was based on a lot of consultation. Well, in the 10 years after that, solar PV costs came down 85%, far more rapidly than anticipated. In addition, and I've got an appendix to chapter 3, put an appendix because not everyone likes economics.
No, we do, I promise.
Another source of falling costs, and that's a fall in the cost of capital. Real interest rates historically low. Real interest rates around the world at the moment, they're lower now than a month ago,
a day ago.
Are negative in real terms in all of the developed countries. You can borrow in Germany for 30 years and the bank will pay you for taking their money. 30-year bonds in the United States are much less than expected inflation, so a negative real yield.
Now, we do know some economists say this is not overall a good thing in general, but it's good in the case of ramping up infrastructure for renewable energy.
Well, I think it is a good thing in general, actually. There's a bit of a diversion, but the greatest economist of the 20th century, John Maynard Keynes, wrote an article to cheer up his students in Cambridge at the depth of the Great Depression in 1930, the economics of our grandchildren, when he said that the capitalist system accumulating capital will lead to zero interest rates about 100 years from now, he said in 1901, about 1930. And then you don't have to worry about income distribution because no one will have a high income simply because they...
All right, it's another 10 years to go on that. Okay. All right.
But why that's so important for renewable energy versus coal is that nearly all the cost of renewable energy is capital, it's the equipment, and the running costs are relatively low, whereas if you put in a coal generator in Newcastle, then more than half your costs are going to be the running costs year after year of buying coal, mining the coal, and or buying the coal. It's just the cost of the initial equipment that comes down with a low interest rate. The other costs stay the same. So the fall in the cost of capital has systematically favoured renewable energy and storage of energy because the same characteristic of being nearly all capital is there for pumped hydro storage, battery storage as for renewable energy. So the two reasons renewable energy become much, much cheaper and non-renewable energy hasn't become cheaper. And the other big reason why that's a special advantage for Australia is that we have distinctively the richest renewable energy resources in the developed world, the best combinations of solar and wind resources, which mean if we don't muck it up, and from time to time we try quite hard to muck things up, but if we don't muck it up, we'll have the lowest cost energy in the world, and therefore a comparative advantage in energy intensive industries. Now it just happens that we are also the source of most of the largest quantum of mineral raw materials requiring energy for processing, including iron, steel, silicon, titanium, vanadium, much else.
So can we talk about that? Because
So that gives Australia in the zero emissions world economy a great comparative advantage. Laurie wants to shut me down before I complete the answer.
I don't. I wanted to ask you about that particular aspect.
Before that, I'll just mention one other thing. Then you're going to answer both. The other big thing that's changed is there's much more awareness now of how much carbon we can actually capture in the landscape, in soils, and in the biosphere. I had a chapter on this in both my 2008 and 2011 review, but the scientific work since then, especially the international scientific work in Europe and the United States, has confirmed quantitatively the importance of that. And we happen also to have more opportunities per person than any other country in the world in this area.
All right, so you've anticipated actually my next question, which is fine. But I wanted to ask you also about when you were mentioning our mineral resources. I mean, the industrial opportunity was one of the most fascinating chapters to me in the book, because you're saying some of the stuff that we export now to get processed overseas, we can start to do in Australia. Can you explain a bit about how you see that working?
Yeah, not only that we can start to do in Australia, but the natural thing is for us to do it here in Australia. The first cab off the rank will be doing more of the processing of aluminium here. Well, we are by far the world's biggest exporter of aluminium ores, aluminium oxide. And to turn aluminium oxide into metal, you need a heap of electricity. We do that from coal in Gladstone in Queensland, Newcastle in New South Wales, and Portland in Victoria. Portland, you cart the electricity 500 kilometres from the Latrobe Valley and lose about 17% of it on the way. But in the zero emissions world economy, the cheap way to turn aluminium ore into aluminium metal will be using renewable energy, and Australia's advantage in renewable energy will make us more naturally the home. We only produce about 1% of world aluminium now, very much higher proportion of world aluminium ore. We're the natural home of that. But the really big one, the transformative one for Australia and the world, is probably converting iron ore into iron metal. We've always had a steel industry since the very early days. It was a very competitive exporting steel industry 120 years ago, but became so profitable to turn the world's best iron ore and the world's best metallurgical coal into mineral exports that BHP lost interest in making steel. We didn't put the effort didn't put the investment and the technological development into steel making. In any case, our advantage from having the local metallurgical coal wasn't so great in conventional steel making, because you can cart Australian coal from Newcastle or Gladstone or Mackay, and it's not much. Well, it's actually cheaper in Kobe in Japan or Shanghai than it is in Whyalla. So we didn't get an advantage over that. But the low emissions, zero emissions way to produce iron metal out of iron ore will be using hydrogen made from renewable energy to reduce the iron oxide into iron metal. The exhaust then is, the waste is water instead of carbon dioxide. And Australia will be the low-cost place to make hydrogen in the world. You could put hydrogen into a ship and take it to Kobe or Shanghai and use it to process Australian iron ore there. But you'd be economically pretty dumb to do that, because you lose, for the chemists amongst you, sorry for boring you and repeating what you already know, but to liquefy hydrogen, to put it on a boat, you've got to cool it to minus 253 degrees, almost absolute zero. The closer you get to absolute zero, which is a temperature at which electrons stop vibrating, the more pressure you have to apply, the more energy you use, and you use half the energy in the hydrogen just liquefying, and then it costs a lot to keep it a liquid on a boat. Hydrogen's a nuisance. It's the smallest molecule, and so it seeps out between the molecules of steel, and so you need special materials for the boat. That's expensive. So it's going to be much cheaper to use the hydrogen here in Australia to turn Australian iron ore into metal than it is to cart it to Japan or Korea.
So these scenarios you're describing, Ross, which sound like a huge opportunity, as your book title suggests, what needs to happen to get those settings in place?
Well, the first thing that has to change is the Australian mind, Australian mindset. We're not used to thinking of ourselves as being clever and innovative in manufacturing or in technological developments, except in relation to the mining and agriculture, where we are at the frontiers of innovation, of world productivity and technology. Our mining industry is technologically an advanced industry, but interesting to understand why that didn't pass through to innovation in manufacturing and thinking about ourselves as a competitive manufacturer. One reason is that it was just so profitable to stop at mining that a company like BHP or
It's the same mindset as the sheep's back traditionally was.
Yeah, and that was so rewarding that you diluted your rate of return if you went into manufacturing as well, and you avoided a lot of extra headaches. But the advantages of the Australian location are going to be so great that can overcome a lot of inertia and the fact that technology will have to be changing everywhere as we move towards the zero emissions economy means that the legacy of backward thinking can be stepped over. Everyone will have to do new things, so we can be one of those doing new things. So I think that helps the opportunity in these new industries.
But in your book, I think it's the final chapter, you say, and this is, we should point out the book was published in November, which seems such a long time ago now in so many ways. All right, but you said then there's a chasm between a world that quickly breaks the link between modern economic growth and carbon emissions and a world that fails to do so. The side of the chasm that we're on now is a dangerous place. It would be beyond reckless for the normal human irrationality for us to stay where we are. We clearly have a lot to gain by moving to the other side of the chasm. But after the savage summer that we've just been through, do you think we have started to move?
I think the summer's helped. I think a lot of Australians want to move across anyway. I don't think the balance of balance of the federal parliament reflects Australian community attitudes, and I spent a bit of time in the book reporting on the polling. Right through since I first started my work 2007, there's been majority quite solid community support for.
There were figures last week actually in essential the Essential Vision poll asked people about whether they support net zero in 2050, and for us to work towards net zero in 2050. 75% said yes, 25% said no. It was about 80% to 20 for Labor voters. Not surprisingly, 91 to 9 for Green. But for coalition Liberal voters, it was 68 to 32, more than 2/3. But what I'm wondering is, with the way our politics is operating, is there a gap between what people would like to aspire to and what they'll actually agree to when it comes to change?
Well, I think we do need to draw a distinction between the composition of the parliament and community attitudes. I think there's community tolerance for doing much more than the current parliament wants to do. And the importance of the last summer, I think it does shift. It strengthened a horrible summer, tragic, but it has strengthened the views, the commitment of people who wanted to do things, and it's raised doubts in the mind of a lot of people who previously didn't think we should do anything about climate change. So it helps the balance, and I think that increases the political risk of national political leaders who want to deny the issue, deny the importance of the question, and increases the political opportunity of those who want to move. So I think the summer has made a difference from that point of view. But even when we had carbon pricing, when for a couple of years emissions fell by 8% per annum, more or less exactly the slope that was necessary to give us zero emissions by 2050. It did that without roast lamb costing $120 a kilogram, without wiping out Whyalla and Gladstone and Newcastle. Tony Abbott made that very big campaign against carbon pricing. Even then, if you analyse the polling, there wasn't very strong support for the Abbott position. He became Prime Minister on other grounds, but he became leader of the Liberal Party on the carbon issue.
Yeah. But it doesn't look like the current government's going to shift on that, and that leads to another question, because in your book you actually say we shouldn't try to advocate, or you're not going to advocate, even though you think carbon pricing is an efficient mechanism, until there's actual bipartisan support.
Yeah.
And last night on 7:30, Lee Sales interviewed the Prime Minister, and he made very clear that that we were not going to see a shift in the basic policy for him, which is basically to go through on a reduction of emission through a technology plan, which wasn't spelt out particularly clearly. And he actually said that he wasn't going to have a target that provides a reverse tax on the Australian economy, which could that mean, I'm sorry, I don't actually understand what that means, but could that mean carbon pricing or something like that?
Well, I think a reverse tax would sound pretty good to most people. The money comes back from consolidated revenue into your pocket. But, but even that statement is not the statement of leaders of the Liberal Party over the last 10 years. He's saying we'll reduce emissions, we'll get there through new technology. Well, that's not what Tony Abbott was saying. He was saying we wouldn't get there at all, and we shouldn't get there at all. There's no need to get there before. Now, there's all sorts of reasons why a market mechanism like a general carbon price will give you more efficient results, economically better results than a technological solution. I spent a few years in China early in the reform, and I used to contrast in my mind the mind of Zhejiang, the reformist premier who was responsible for implementing a lot of the early market-based reform, and Li Peng, his vice premier, who had an engineering background and wanted to engineer every solution. Well, it was Zhejiang's reform that led to the huge economic progress in China, and the engineers would have kept reproducing the Soviet economy. Market mechanisms bring alive the creativity of very wide ranges of people in community, whereas if you're just focusing on the technology, you'll narrow your scope, you'll put a lot of effort into some things and not others. Governments will be making decisions on what is preferred. Nevertheless, you can get there.
So what is the workaround? What are the ways to get there, do you think?
Well, I think it would help a lot if we had a very clear goal that we're heading to zero emissions by a certain time, like 2050. Once we're committed to 2050 and seeing we're getting there and it's doing its good.
We'll be there before 2030 at this university, by the way.
Yeah, once we've got a commitment to 2050 and we're making progress towards it, we'll actually be bringing forward that date. And we'll see economic as well as other advantages in bringing forward that date. But 2050 helps get the mindset first. And that helps focus everyone on clearing the mind of irrelevant, diversive alternatives. Still today, there are people associated with the coal power generation industry who still have the hope that somehow government will keep them alive and will provide money, subsidies of various kinds to help them build the next coal-based generator. If you're quite clear that you're heading towards zero emissions by a certain time, then those thoughts can't enter your mind. And it's really.
But how do we stop the power of the coal industry? Because essentially, this would seem to be, and it's not just the government; it's also Labor talks up elements of what's happening with coal. We don't seem to have the clarity that you're suggesting we need in order to make real progress.
Well, the coal industry does have a lot of political power in this country, and if they retain that power, then that's a problem for our democracy, a flaw in our democracy. When you get a flaw in your democracy, a democratic polity removes it. I think it's for Australians generally to think about how we use our democratic processes to correct some of the weaknesses in our policy-making processes that have given disproportionate influence to some interests on this issue, particularly the coal interests.
Yeah. What do you make of an initiative that got trumpeted this week in Tasmania? I think it's a $50 million initiative supported by the Tasmanian government, which is a coalition government, to set up a hydroelectricity, a hydropower scheme there.
Yeah. First, it's a really important fact that in Australia that we've got 3 coalition state governments in New South Wales, South Australia and Tasmania, and they're all very strongly supportive of action on climate change and transition, the energy transition that needs to be undertaken. So the federal coalition is out of line with those 3 state coalition governments. Tasmania is already nearly zero emissions in its energy. It's got a history of wonderful hydro resources, being quite controversial, expanding their scope. We probably won't see new dams built, but what's there can be used in different ways to create a huge potential for energy-intensive processing. Historically in Tasmania, those big dams, big generators have provided power right around the clock. The same dams, the same water could supply a lot more peaking power. And Tasmania's doesn't have great solar, better than the best place in Germany, but the poorest in Australia. But it does have very good wind, and so they can use wind power to conserve on the hydro power when the wind's blowing, and then run the hydro generator, so you've got a balanced power supply through the year. both of them very low-cost sources of supply, and then use that for energy-intensive industries. And because you're conserving the use of the hydro for the peak times and using wind at other times, the total amount of power you can produce from zero-emission sources is very much larger. So that's one of the natural homes of industry in the zero-carbon world economy. And using it for hydrogen, well, hydrogen's going to be an important part of the industry future of Australia in the zero emissions world economy. I've mentioned iron. There will be some hydrogen exports, I think not for processing metals, because it'll be much cheaper to do that in Australia, much cheaper, but Japan and Korea have poor opportunities for their own renewable energy, so they will be wanting to import renewable hydrogen and for running trucks, buses, other high energy intensity forms of transport. They'll be wanting some hydrogen for balancing their electricity networks, and places in Australia with an established industrial infrastructure and ports and low-cost renewables can do that, and Tasmania is one of them.
All right, that's good to know. You mentioned also, and in the, I suppose, with other state government initiatives like in South Australia and elsewhere in Victoria, that there may be perhaps enough going on to create the kind of momentum that will make people feel like we're getting somewhere with this.
Yeah.
Why not just go further
Yeah.
down the renewables pathway? In your book, you say that all of this is going to happen gradually and then suddenly. Given your past prowess in predicting when we'd start to feel the more horrible effects of climate change and the kind of summer we've just had, when do you think that switch is going to go from gradually to suddenly, and all of a sudden this debate about where, should we be going for net zero? How should we do it? Should we all work together to achieve that? Can we now grasp the opportunity that's there? When do you think that's going to kick in?
Well, I think it won't happen at exactly the same time in all activities, but I think generally it might be kicking in now. I don't think we could have had this same discussion about zero net emissions a couple of years ago with such broadly based support. Even the Prime Minister and the coalition government in Canberra is not opposing it. They're saying we'll get there by other means. We'll get there without saying we'll do it through technology.
Well, people have achieved things without saying they'll do them,
Yeah.
so it is perhaps it's possible.
Yeah, if you're going to do it, it's a pity not to do it, because you actually help the global momentum.
Yeah.
If you say you're doing it, if you don't say you're doing it, you can look to be a drag on the global momentum. So if you're going to do it, you might as well say you're
And
doing
then groups
it.
like the Business Council have spoken up
Yeah.
now, and so,
Yeah. So
there's more of that, yeah?
Yeah, so I think we might be seeing a breaking of the resistance right at the moment. But industry by industry, we'll see the move from gradually to suddenly at different times. I think it's happening right now in energy because it is just so expensive to keep those old coal generators going, and if you do it properly, so cheap to do it with solar and renewable. You do need to change many aspects of regulation of your system. You need new transmission. We should have been planning for this all along. A lot of my 2008 report was about what we should do to be ready for it. Well, we weren't ready for it, and that's a problem now. But I think there's a very widespread recognition now that's the cheap way to go. For cars, transport, about 20% of Australian emissions, a lot of it in the petrol and diesel we put into cars and trucks and buses and trains. And it's only going to be a few years. I've got a chapter on transport in the book. It's only going to be a few years before the capital cost of an electric car is as cheap as an internal combustion engine, and all running costs are going to be much lower, much cheaper to maintain. Tesla advises people not to make sure they don't have services in less than 2 years apart, because there's so few moving parts in an electric car. We're about 80 compared with about 1,000 for internal combustion engine. So the engine requires much less maintenance and servicing, much cheaper to maintain, and then it lasts much longer for the same reason. So you'll own it for much longer.
You've got an electric car, so.
No, that's Susanna's.
Oh, okay. I just had a ride. So yeah, it was very good.
And the capital cost of the electric cars coming down. Bloomberg New Energy Finance, which has got teams of people studying this, reckons that by 2023 the capital costs will be down. I think from that point it will happen suddenly. And local government areas that are not putting in the charging services will come under huge pressure to do so. And a few years after that, then you'll have to make a huge financial sacrifice to run an old-fashioned car, just like someone wanting to run a T-model Ford these days can have the satisfaction of doing it, but will pay a fortune for it.
Great. How many people here have got electric cars? Or any cars? I want to throw it open to questions. And are there mics roving around? Just one quick question before we go to questions. And that is, the debate seems to be there seems to be a recurrent theme in all the discussions about how much is it going to cost to transition to carbon neutrality, what's the cost of not doing it. As an economist, do you think economists should be throwing a whole batch of figures into the mix, or is it a kind of debate where everyone can kind of come up with a hugely exorbitant series of expenses that are going to be associated with changing or not changing?
Well, back in 2008, I threw an unconscionable number of numbers into the mix. And I estimated the costs of Australia doing its fair share in a global move to hold temperature increases to 2 degrees. And it was non-trivial. By the middle of the century, it'd be costing us a couple of % of GDP. That's not trivial, but nor is it overwhelming. I mean, carving 0.1% per annum or a bit more of annual growth rates over 4 decades. So is that arithmetic right? No, not quite. But a modest annual sacrifice. And then from the middle of the century, we'd start to get that back from reduced costs of climate change. By the end of the century, we'd have it all back plus more, and then the benefits overwhelm the cost from then on. That was a modelling back in 2008. If I did the same modelling today, it would show very much lower costs of reducing emissions. One of the groups that worked with me on that modelling was the Centre for Policy Studies, then at Monash, now at Victoria University. They're working with the Commonwealth Treasury and the Queensland Treasury. We had a huge effort going on, and that Centre for Policy Studies group, Philip Adams, is having a bit of a rough go right now at redoing some of those numbers, not changing everything, but just changing a couple of the crucial things. And I'm pretty sure that we're going to be looking at, well, once you get all of the new numbers in place, negligible costs, but the benefits haven't changed all that much. The costs of climate change, and therefore the benefits of avoiding climate change, still look pretty much as they looked in 2008. We might be more precise about them. There's a reduction in uncertainty, but there hasn't been a big change in average expectations of the costs of climate change. I go through that in the early chapters of the book. Whereas in 2008, we'd pay something, not a huge amount, in the early stages from being part of the transition away from a carbon economy, but that was clearly outweighed by the benefits of avoiding climate change. Today, we get the same benefits from avoiding climate change, but we probably don't have significant costs early, and within a few years for Australia, those costs will actually be benefits.
Great. Thanks. Liz.
Hello. Thank you so much for your book.
Not on this.
Got it? Yeah.
Great.
Thank you so much for your book. It's so important to have hope. Obviously a climate crisis. And I think I'm reflecting back on the Paris COP21 agreement and a sense of false hope coming up in that, because emissions are still rising despite all of the agreements that put into effect there. to ask about offsetting. You talk about the transition to a global zero emissions economy and these Australian carbon credit units entering into the European carbon market and hopefully other ones, trading currently at around $10 to $13, and that aggregates to a tonne of avoided carbon emissions. And I'm just wondering, is it more carbon carrot than stick to have large emitters simply purchasing ACCUs? And is there any modelling to show that offsetting really does reduce emissions so far?
Yeah. I am not so negative about Paris, as you can see from the book. That was a very important step forward. You have to understand what Paris was. It was a commitment to an endpoint to hold temperature increases below 2 degrees and as close as possible to 1.5. It was a commitment to a new process whereby countries would make their own national decisions on what they were going to contribute to this. And everyone knew that in the early stages they would not add up to the solution. And periodically, every 5 years, leaders would meet and put pressure on each other and ratchet up commitment. And that's the way we'd get there by 2050. This approach, which I call concerted unilateral mitigation, came out of the wreckage of the failed Copenhagen meeting in 2009. And the last night of that meeting, or the last night leaders were there, Barack Obama met with the heads of government of China, India, Brazil, South Africa, and hammered out really that approach. It was just in outline then and began to take form in Cancun and shape the movement up to Paris. I think that can work, and already it has had a significant effect. Obama committed the United States to a substantial reduction in emissions by 2020, and he got the US on that course, or not only him, but what was happening in US business and the US states, where state governments, municipal governments were doing quite a lot, pressure from NGOs for closure of coal and so on. The US has been on that course, and remarkably, Trump has not been able to significantly change it yet. If he got another 4 years, then he may be more effective. But the US has stayed on that more or less on that Obama course. The other big national emitter, China, in the first 12 years of this century, emissions were growing by around almost 10% per annum. And as I said in my 2008 review, if China stayed long on that course, there'd be no hope for the world dealing with the climate problem, whatever the rest of the world did. Well, the good news is that China didn't stay on that course. If I've got a chart in the book that shows Chinese emissions to 2000 to 2012, and then there's a marked break in emissions from 2014. They actually fell for 3 years. They kicked up again, nowhere near that sharp pace of early in the century, but they've kicked up a bit since 2016 in response to the recessionary impact of the Trump trade wars. And it's crucially important, as I say in this book, that China get back on that course.
What about the coronavirus? What might the impact of that? I know we've seen images recently of, you know, how the reduction in emissions has equated Chile's entire emissions for a year, but surely that's not grounds for optimistic thinking about the longer term, and the kind of thinking that the coronavirus might throw back into the arena of climate.
Yeah, the coronavirus is very bad for global incomes, for global development. I saw data from last week where China's coal power use generation was about half a year ago. So in the very short term, that's pretty good for emissions. But
They want to ramp up again.
But that's temporary, and the risk is that China, with its centrally planned economy, does manage recessions by a lot of government intervention, and historically the simple way to intervene has been to fire up the old economy, because you've got spare capacity lying there for all the old things, the energy intensive industry, so the risk is that, as in 1998 in response to the Asian financial crisis, 2008 in response to the global financial crisis, China again will just fire up the old economy. And this is where the new model of growth in China and the recognition of China's interest in effective global mitigation will be a constraint. I don't think this response will be the same as in 1998 and 2008. Whether it will be good enough is an important question. But just back on the Paris commitments, China committed, and it was a big step at the time, and it came out of negotiations discussions between Xi Jinping and Barack Obama, committed to allowing it to putting a peak on its emissions by 2030, and that was new. Historically, the international agreements haven't put caps on developing country emissions, and saying that the first step should be taken by developed countries. Well, China departed from that with the acceptance of the 2030 cap, and it looked for a while as if the real cap might have been 2014. Now, whether that turns out to be the case depends on responses to the question Laurie just asked. What will be the response to the coronavirus? But generally, a short-term economic hit, while it helps reduce emissions in the very short term, is not helpful in the long term. We've got to solve this problem not by stopping economic development. If it's a choice between the people of Africa staying miserably poor and contributing greenhouse gas emissions, they'll choose to contribute greenhouse gas emissions if that's the choice. No doubt about that. So the solution has to be not to stop global development, but to change the relationship between economic activity and impact on the environment. And fortunately today we know we've got the technologies to allow that to happen at a reasonable cost.
Great. Yeah.
You've talked a lot about hydrogen being at least part of the solution, a large part of the solution. Could you say what the disadvantages are for hydrogen? Like, what are the concerns that there might be around hydrogen? And a separate question if there's time is also, can you comment at all on what needs to be done about the grid?
Yeah. I myself don't see very many disadvantages in hydrogen. Now, any industrial process is dangerous, so you've got to do it right. And just like if you've got a big container of methane on the back of a truck, you can have a pretty big explosion if you mismanage it. Well, you can do the same with hydrogen. So you've got to manage it right, and so we need safety arrangements. We need lots of precautions about managing it well, but that's just a normal accompaniment of responsible industrial development. I don't see anything special about hydrogen. The changes in the grid, well, even to supply existing Australian electricity demand with zero emissions electricity would be greatly advantaged by having more long distance transmission. In the zero emissions, if we were simply turning our existing electricity supply and demand into zero emissions, we'd probably have more decentralized electricity, but also more long distance movement of electricity. And the two things are not contradictory. Less investment in distribution within the city, because there's more local distribution, but then more interregional transfers. The advantage of the interregional transfers is that it allows you to balance weather conditions, climatic conditions in different places. The very good wind resource of Western Victoria, or the west coast, the west-facing coasts of South Australia, wind blows at very different times from northern New South Wales, which is another good resource. If they're both joined into transmission systems, when the wind's not blowing in one place, it may very well be blowing in another. It's not cloudy in Mildura and Gladstone at the same time. So solar energy is more diverse. There's an hour time difference, solar time, between the western extremity of the grid in Port Lincoln and the eastern extremity in Brisbane. You've got summer-winter variations in the timing of solar output in central Queensland and Melbourne. So long-distance transmission allows you to balance weather conditions in different parts of the country. It also allows you to economise on what generation capacity you have. A shortage in one area can be balanced by a surplus in another, and it allows you to economise on storage. We've got some very low-cost opportunities for large-scale pumped hydro storage in Australia. Long-distance transmission allows the benefits of that to be shared more widely.
I suppose I was also thinking, you pointed out that us sending our power from the Latrobe Valley to Portland is a loss of, 17% or something along the transmission. So I suppose I was thinking, is anything being done to reduce that? Because as you say, there's a lot of benefits for having this sort of systems that you don't need the battery capacity so much. You can,
Yes, there are new technologies that are being used in other places. Some of the not so new technologies. If you watch the film or read the book about Tesla, these debates about AC and DC were there at the foundation of the electrical systems of developed countries. But I visited people in Shanghai a couple of months ago who'd just been responsible for putting in a direct current cable from the far west of China to Anhui province on the coast just north of Shanghai, a distance from Melbourne to Perth and back at least to Kalgoorlie, probably to Adelaide, with a transmission pipe bigger than the whole Victorian electricity output, and they estimated in that distance, Melbourne to Perth and back to Adelaide, they were losing 6% of the power over that long distance. That was a matter of scale and technology. There are different ways of doing it. Yeah.
We may have to wrap up. I know there are a lot of questions, but it is getting towards 2 o'clock. We might have to wrap up. I know you're going to hang around and possibly sign some copies of your book, but before you leave the podium, I'd like to invite onto the stage the Vice Chancellor, Professor John Dewey, to say a few words as well. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you. So before I thank Ross, I thought I'd just say a few words about the Latrobe University Press. It's a joint venture with Black Ink, as you may know, and the idea is that they do all the printing, publishing, the distribution and the marketing, and we provide essentially the guarantee that no book will lose Black Ink money. And if the book sells really well, then we plough the profits back into publishing more books in the series. We've had a few big wins. So Toby Walsh's books on artificial intelligence, the rights of that have been sold all around the world. That's enabled us to publish other books that don't have such a big audience, but are nevertheless really important books. So, for example, the collected works of George Seddon that we published recently, you may have known George, or the Susan Lawrence's history of sludge, of the effects of gold mining in Victoria. Really important books, but probably not such a big audience. We've been absolutely delighted with this success. When the editorial committee sent me the proposal for Ross's book, they said, look, we think this is a really important book, very timely. And it's written by Ross Garnaut, who is obviously a superstar. But it's about economics. So he said, look, on balance, we think we'll take the risk. It has now sold 14,500 copies, which I think tells us a number of things. One is that Ross is indeed a superstar, but secondly, that economics is actually not that boring. And thirdly, that this is
It mostly is.
this is a really well-written book. I mean, if anyone is going to make economics widely and publicly accessible, it's Ross. I was talking to Justin Wolfers, another economist who's in Australia at the moment. He's made a few appearances on TV. He's at the University of Michigan, but he's an Aussie. He's from Sydney. And we were talking about how in the US it just seems easier, maybe this was an Obama era thing, but it just seems easier for economists to get access to the corridors of power and have real influence over government decision making. And why was that so difficult in Australia? But we talked about Ross as an example of someone who's really bucked that trend, someone who is highly regarded and actually actively sought out by policymakers, whose work will be quoted on morning radio frequently. And in fact, the phrase superpower, low carbon superpower, is being used widely now, even though people may not actually know where it comes from. It's literally in the matter of months this has entered the Australian vernacular, because it's fundamentally a message of real hope, Ross, and I think that's what has really grabbed people's imagination, is that this is essentially an optimistic book that says if we can only change our mindset, that Australian mindset you were talking about, there are huge opportunities for this country that lie ahead. In addition, obviously, to mitigating the horrors that we saw in the bushfires over the summer, which you predicted. In fact, almost exactly to the year, you forecast this back in 2008 as a real risk. So we're doing our bit here at La Trobe. We'll be net zero by 2029. But exactly as you've said, it makes economic sense for us to do that, because the cost of drawing energy off the grid that's been generated in the old-fashioned way is just getting far too expensive. So in addition to the bottle of wine that Laurie would like me to give you, and for which I've also got another La Trobe University Press publication by another economist who has also entered the corridors of power. It's by Andrew Lee, who you might know, Labour member for one of the Canberra seats, a very distinguished economist in his previous life as an academic. It's on randomised trials. It's called Randomistas. Great read. And again, showing how economics can really inform decision-making in a really important way. So we hope you might enjoy that, Ross. But in the meantime, could you join with me in thanking one of the most influential